This was the fall of 2019. I was 26, living in Portland at the time, and I'd driven down to Astoria for the day to visit a friend who just had a kid. Astoria is only about 2 hours from Portland on a good day, so it's the kind of trip where you don't really think twice about it. You just go. I stayed longer than I planned. That always happens when you're catching up with someone you haven't seen in a while. And by the time I hugged them goodbye and got back in my car, it was pushing 11 p.m. The drive back up 30 follows the Columbia River for a long stretch before you eventually merge back toward Portland. It's a nice road in daylight, but at night it narrows down and gets rural fast. The river's right there on your left the whole time, and the hills drop off on the right. There's not a lot of margin for error if you drift. I'd driven it plenty of times, though, including at night, and it never really bothered me. I had a podcast going, I wasn't particularly tired, and I figured I'd be home by 1 at the latest. The fog didn't show up until I was maybe 40 minutes out of Astoria. It started as this low haze sitting on the river, which you see a lot on that stretch. Nothing alarming. But within about 10 minutes, it had moved off the water and onto the road, and it thickened fast. I mean, really fast. The kind of progression that doesn't feel natural. I went from full visibility to maybe 30 feet in front of me, and I had to drop down to 40 miles an hour just to feel like I had any reaction time. I turned my podcast off. I don't know why, but the second the fog got bad, I felt like I needed to hear what was around me. That's probably instinct more than logic, but I'm glad I did. I drove like that for a while. Slow, focused, both hands on the wheel. There were no other cars coming in either direction, which was actually more unsettling than it sounds. You get used to headlights. You get used to the occasional confirmation that other people exist and you're still on a road that leads somewhere. When there's nothing, the isolation becomes its own kind of pressure. It was somewhere around Rainier when I first noticed the car, or what I thought was a car. There were taillights ahead of me, about 60 feet out, barely visible through the fog. Red, dim, sitting low. I eased off the gas a little. I wasn't trying to ride up on someone, and kept pace with what I assumed was another driver taking it slow like me. I actually felt a small measure of relief. Another person on the road. Evidence that the world still existed past the front of my windshield. I followed those lights for probably 10 minutes. The road curved. The lights curved with it. Everything tracked. I kept a consistent distance and just focused on following. It was actually easier than navigating by my own headlights alone. Then the road straightened out for a long stretch, and I noticed something that took me a few seconds to process. The taillights were the only lights. No headlights, no outline of a car body. Just the 2 red points floating in the fog. No roof, no mirrors, no shape around them. I leaned forward in my seat, like that was going to help me see better. I told myself it was the fog doing something optical, washing out the body of the car while the lights stayed visible. That seemed plausible. I kept following. Then they stopped. Not slowed, stopped. I hit the brakes hard enough that I felt my seatbelt lock, and I came to a halt maybe 20 feet behind where the lights were hovering. Hovering is the right word. Because when I stopped, I realized they weren't at road level. They were maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground, which would have been the right height for taillights on a sedan. but there was nothing supporting them. No car, no shape, just two red lights hanging in the dark. I sat there with my foot on the brake for what felt like a long time. My brain was doing that thing where it keeps offering explanations and discarding them faster than it can generate new ones. Reflectors on a sign, some kind of construction marker, a truck that was positioned at a weird angle. I went through every option. The lights didn't move while I was sitting there. They just held position in the fog, maybe 20 feet ahead of my bumper. I put the car in reverse. I wasn't going around them. I don't know why, but I wasn't. I backed up slowly, maybe 30 feet, and then I stopped again and looked. They were still there. Same height, same position. I sat there for a good 2 minutes. Then, slowly, they drifted left. Not like a car signaling, just a gradual, smooth lateral drift until they moved off the road entirely and disappeared into the dark. I drove home without stopping. I didn't get out to look at whatever they'd been hovering in front of. I didn't turn around to investigate. I just drove. The thing I've thought about most in the years since is the height. Whatever those lights were attached to, or whatever was generating them, was not sitting on the road. They were elevated in a way that had no straightforward explanation. I've tried to retrofit a rational answer onto that detail for a long time, and I still don't have one that holds up. This happened in the fall of 2021, and I still think about it probably more than I should. I live in coastal South Carolina, a small town called Beaufort. It's one of those places that's genuinely beautiful, but also kind of inherently creepy in a way that's hard to articulate. Spanish moss on every tree, tidal marshland everywhere you look, the kind of place where the light does weird things even on a normal day. The fog here isn't like regular fog. It's thick and wet, and it smells like salt and pluff mud, which is that sulfur smell that comes off the marsh. If you've never been to the low country, pluff mud smells like something between low tide and something rotting. You either love it or you don't. I grew up with it, so it doesn't bother me. I was a volunteer with the county's environmental monitoring program at the time. Part of that work involved going out early morning, sometimes before dawn, to check water salinity levels and document wildlife activity in the tidal creeks around the marsh. I'd been doing it for about 3 years. I knew the area well enough to navigate it, mostly in the dark. That particular morning, I was out at a section of marsh we called the back channel, about a half-mile down a dirt road where the tidal creek widens into this shallow basin ringed by cordgrass. I got there around 5 a.m. The fog was completely impenetrable. I'm not exaggerating when I say I could barely see my own outstretched hand. I'd been in fog on the marsh before, but not like this. I stood at the edge of the water, and I genuinely could not see the opposite bank, which on a clear day was maybe 60 feet away. It was just white. White in every direction. I should have gone home. The monitoring protocol had a weather clause. If conditions were unsafe, you were supposed to skip the session and log a weather report. But I'd already driven out there, and I only had 4 sample sites left before I could close out the month's data set. So I justified it. It wasn't dangerous, I told myself. I wasn't getting in the water. I just needed to pull my meter out of the sediment and take readings at 4 spots along the bank. 20 minutes, maybe 30. I'd done it 1,000 times. I started with the first site, maybe 20 feet south of where I'd parked. Got my reading, logged it. Normal, Moved to the second site. Also normal. I was working efficiently, moving along the bank by feel as much as sight, and I had no sense of anything being wrong. The third site was about 40 feet further down the bank, at the base of this weathered wooden stake that I'd hammered in myself 2 seasons earlier to mark the location. I crouched down to pull the meter up, and I was in the middle of noting the reading when I heard it. A footstep, or what sounded like one. The soft, sucking sound of a foot pulling out of wet pluff mud. I went still. I turned my head and listened. Another one. Slow. Maybe 15 feet to my right, somewhere out in the fog over the water. My immediate thought was a great blue heron, because they wade through the shallows and they make that exact sound. I've spooked dozens of them on early morning surveys. The timing was right. Herons are active before dawn. I actually started to relax. I waited to hear the massive wing beat that usually followed when you disturbed one. It didn't come. Instead, there was another step, then another, moving at a pace that was deliberate and steady, maybe 4 or 5 seconds between each one. Not a bird. The rhythm was too measured, too intentional. I turned on my headlamp and pointed it toward the water. I couldn't see anything. The fog just bounced the light back at me like a wall. I was essentially shining a flashlight into cotton. The sound stopped. I held the headlamp steady and waited, still crouched at the bank. Nothing. Total silence. After a minute, I convinced myself I'd heard something wading through the shallows. A deer, maybe, or a large raccoon. It happens out there. I turned back to my meter and finished logging the reading. I'd taken maybe 3 steps toward the 4th site when the sound started again. This time it was closer, much closer. 12 feet at most, still out in the water but tracking along the bank at exactly the pace I was walking. Step for step. I stopped. It stopped. I took 3 more steps toward the 4th site. 3 sounds from the water. 3 steps. Exact cadence. I turned the headlamp back toward the water and held it there and said hello. I said it loud and clear, and I wasn't embarrassed about it. I wanted whatever was out there to know I was a person. I wanted a response. What I got was silence for about 4 seconds. And then 1 more step. 1 single, slow footstep in the mud, directly toward where I was standing. I left. I didn't finish the last reading. I walked back to my truck faster than I should have on uneven ground in the dark, got in, and sat there with the engine running for about 5 minutes before I finally pulled out. I've gone back to the back channel dozens of times since then. I've been out in fog since then too, though never as thick as that morning. I've never heard that sound again. I've talked to other volunteers about it, and nobody had anything useful. One of them suggested a gator, but gators don't wade on 2 legs through shallow water, and the spacing of the footsteps was wrong for 4-legged movement. Whatever was out there was walking upright. I closed out the month's data set with a gap at Site 4. I still think about what was following me along that bank. This was the winter of 2020, January specifically, so right before everything went sideways with the world. I was living in Flagstaff at the time, going to NAU. My roommate Dre and I had been planning a backcountry snowshoe trip into the San Francisco peaks for most of the fall. We finally locked in a long weekend and drove up the forest road on a Friday afternoon. For context on the area, The San Francisco Peaks are these volcanic mountains north of Flagstaff that top out just above 12,000 feet. The upper elevations get serious snow starting in November, and by January the whole place is buried. It's stunning terrain. Dre and I had been up there in summer, but never in winter, and we'd done our homework. We had the right gear, a permit, the whole thing. We camped at the trailhead Friday night and started in early Saturday morning. The plan was to snowshoe up to a saddle at about 10,000 feet, set up a day camp, explore the ridgeline, and come back down before dark. The first couple hours were perfect. Cold but manageable, skies were clear, visibility unlimited in every direction. The kind of mountain morning that makes you feel like you made all the right decisions. The fog came in fast, around 9:30. Mountain fog is different from coastal fog. It moves like something alive, coming up out of the drainages and pooling against the slopes. One minute we were in clear air, and then Dre said something like, "Uh-oh." And I looked upslope, and it was just rolling down toward us. Within 15 minutes, we were in it. We weren't in danger. We were on a marked trail. We'd both used a compass before. We slowed down and stayed close together and just kept moving. The plan was to reach the saddle and reassess. We were approaching mile marker 9 when I first saw it, or thought I did. It was off to the left of the trail, maybe 30 feet into the trees, just a shape standing between two spruce. Tall, but the fog was warping distances, so I wasn't sure how tall. The first time I looked, I blinked and it was gone. Tree, I figured. The fog was doing strange things to shadows and shapes. It had already made boulders look like crouching animals twice. I didn't say anything to Dre. I kept moving. About 5 minutes later, I saw it again. This time there was no ambiguity about it being a tree. It was standing in the open, just uphill of the trail, and it was watching us. That's the only word for what it was doing. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making any sound. It was just standing there in a posture that read as patient, waiting. I grabbed Dre's arm and stopped. He looked at me, and then looked to where I was pointing. We both stared into the fog. "That's a person," he said. His voice was flat in a way that told me he was trying not to sound as alarmed as he was. I called out. I said hello. I said we were hikers. I said if you need help, let us know. Standard stuff. What you'd say to someone you didn't want to frighten. Nothing. Not a response. Not a movement. Not any acknowledgement that the figure had heard me at all. Dre said we should keep moving. I agreed. We started back up the trail, and I kept checking over my left shoulder every 30 seconds or so. The figure stayed where it was as we moved up and away from it. It didn't follow. By the time we were maybe 200 feet past it, the fog had swallowed it completely. We made it to the saddle and had a muted version of the day we'd planned. Dre and I are both the kind of people who don't make a huge deal out of things, but neither of us felt like exploring the ridgeline after that. We ate lunch, took some photos, and started back down around noon. The fog was still thick on the way down. Maybe thicker. We were moving faster because the trail was mostly downhill, and we both just wanted to get back to camp. We were passing back through the area near mile marker 9 when Dre stopped dead in the trail and grabbed my arm. He didn't say anything. He just pointed. The figure was back. Same spot, roughly. Uphill of the trail, standing in the open, facing us. Except this time it was closer. Maybe 15 feet off the trail instead of 30. and I could see it clearly enough through the fog to understand that whatever it was not a person, not a normal one. The proportions were wrong. The arms were too long. The way it was standing, the angle of the shoulders, the tilt of the head. Nothing tracked with how a human being stands when they're just waiting on a hillside. We did not stop. We did not speak to it. We moved past it at a pace that was just short of jogging, and neither of us looked away from it as we went. It didn't follow. It just turned, slowly, to track us as we passed. The head rotating to follow our movement, the body staying perfectly still. I watched it over my shoulder until the fog closed in again and I couldn't see it anymore. We made it back to the trailhead in just over an hour and got in the car without breaking down camp. We just threw our packs in the back and left. The tent and the cook kit and everything else came later, when we were no longer thinking about whether to be more scared than practical. We talked about it on the drive back down into Flagstaff. We tried out a lot of explanations, the way you do. Another hiker in strange gear, a tree in a weird position, something that the fog and exhaustion had distorted into a shape our brains interpreted as threatening. The thing we kept landing on, though, was the head turning. Neither of us had imagined that. We'd both seen it. You don't mistake a tree rotating to watch you for something you invented. And whatever was standing on that hillside, twice, at the same location, watching the trail, it was interested in us in a way that didn't have a clean explanation. I looked up reports of unusual sightings in the peaks later. There aren't a lot of them, but they exist. Most are vague. One from 2017 described a tall figure observed from the tree line, standing completely still at roughly the same elevation we'd been at. I don't know what it was. I've been back to that area twice since then. Both times in summer, both times without incident. I keep an eye on the tree line at mile marker 9 when I pass it now. I don't think I'll do a winter trip up there again.